St. Mary's General Hospital, a symbol of medical excellence in a wealthy suburban area, was on the brink of an unforeseen challenge. Angela Parker, a gifted black nurse, joined the staff without any idea of the deep-rooted prejudices she was about to face. As conflicts intensified and tensions rose, a seemingly ordinary patient, Thomas Edwards, observed silently from his hospital bed. But Mr. Edwards wasn't just any patient. His presence was about to change everything. What hidden influence did this mysterious patient hold? And how could one nurse's fight spark institutional transformation? Let's dive in. The polished halls of St. Mary's General Hospital sparkled under fluorescent lights as Angela Parker stepped inside for the first time. The air carried the sharp scent of disinfectant, mingled with an unspoken tension that made her stomach twist. Despite her nerves, Angela straightened her posture, lifting her chin with determination. She was here to leave a positive impression. Approaching the nurse's station, Angela noticed the sudden hush that swept through the room. Conversations dropped to whispers, and eyes quickly averted, avoiding her gaze as if contact itself was unwelcome. Swallowing hard, she pushed aside the familiar sting of isolation threatening to rise within her. "Excuse me," she began, her voice calm and steady despite her unease. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse. Could you point me to the head nurse's office?" A blonde nurse glanced up, her blue eyes widening briefly before a polished, professional smile appeared. "Of course," she said, her tone polite but chilly. "Down the hall, third door on the right." Angela nodded her thanks and walked away, fully aware of the eyes tracking her every step. The sound of her sensible shoes echoed sharply, each step feeling like a drumbeat in the unnaturally quiet corridor. As she neared the office, a tall man in a white coat stepped out of a nearby room. His salt-and-pepper hair and commanding presence marked him as a senior doctor. Angela's heart quickened with hope. Perhaps this was a chance for a positive introduction. "Good morning, Doctor," she greeted warmly, offering a smile. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse starting today. It's a pleasure to meet you." The doctor's steel-grey eyes flicked over her with an unreadable expression. "Dr. William Greaves," he replied curtly. "I trust you've been fully oriented to our protocols?" Before Angela could respond, he continued, "We uphold exceptionally high standards here at St. Mary's. I hope you're ready to meet them." Without waiting for her reply, he brushed past her, leaving her standing alone in the hallway. Angela's outstretched hand slowly dropped to her side. Though deflated by the interaction, Angela refused to let it crush her spirit. She drew a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and knocked on the head nurse's door, silently vowing to prove her worth. As Angela waited for a response from the head nurse's office, her mind drifted back to her days in nursing school. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, firm yet filled with love. "Baby girl, you'll have to work twice as hard as everyone else," her mother had said, pride and concern mingling in her tone. "But don't you ever let them see you sweat. You come from a long line of strong women, and that same strength runs in you." Angela remembered the countless late nights poring over textbooks, the extra lab hours, and the constant need to prove herself. She thought of the subtle dismissals from professors, the skeptical glances when she aced exams, and the whispered doubts from classmates questioning whether she truly belonged. Despite it all, Angela persevered, graduating at the top of her class and silencing her critics with her determination and skill. The door creaked open, snapping her back to the present. A stern-looking woman with sharp features stood there, her gaze scanning Angela from head to toe. "Miss Parker, I presume," she said briskly. "Come in. We have a lot to cover, and I expect you to keep up." Angela followed her into the office, feeling the weight of expectations settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just a new job, it was a test of her resilience. The rest of Angela's first day was a whirlwind of introductions, orientations, and an avalanche of paperwork. As she moved through the hospital, she couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. Conversations halted as she approached, only to resume in hushed tones once she passed. Attempts at small talk were met with polite but distant responses, making her feel isolated in what was supposed to be a collaborative environment. By the end of her shift, Angela was drained, mentally and emotionally. Gathering her things from her locker, she overheard two nurses whispering around the corner. "Did you see the new hire?" One said quietly. "Yeah," the other replied. "I don't know what they were thinking. This isn't exactly the place for, you know." Angela froze, her hand gripping the locker door as the words sank in. She had hoped the frosty reception was just first-day jitters, but now it was clear. This was deeper than that. Feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her, Angela headed to the bus stop, her mind a storm of emotions. The excitement she felt that morning had been replaced by doubt and a gnawing sense of isolation. Sitting on the hard plastic bench, she pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. After a couple of rings, her mother's warm voice came through. "Hey, baby girl, how was your first day?" Hearing her mother's voice, Angela felt tears prick her eyes. She took a shaky breath, determined not to break down. "It was challenging, Mama," she admitted quietly. There was a pause before her mother spoke, her tone steady and full of strength. "Angela Marie Parker, you listen to me. You've worked too hard and come too far to let anyone make you feel less than you are. Remember where you come from and who you are. You're not just there for yourself. You're there for every little black girl who dreams of walking those halls one day." Angela closed her eyes, letting her mother's words sink in. "I know, Mama. It's just, I didn't think it would be this hard." "Nothing worth doing is ever easy, baby," her mother replied gently. "But you've got the strength of generations behind you. Hold your head high, do your job better than anyone else, and don't you dare let them see you falter." Angela felt a renewed sense of determination wash over her. "Yes, Mama, I hear you." As the call ended, a sleek black Mercedes slowed as it passed the bus stop. Through its tinted windows, Angela caught a glimpse of Dr. Greaves, his gaze locking with hers for a brief moment before the car sped away. Angela straightened her shoulders, her mother's words echoing in her mind. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't about to give up. With the strength of her family and her own resolve, she was ready to face the challenges St. Mary's had in store for her. In the weeks that followed, Angela's experience at St. Mary's General Hospital became a daily battle. The cold reception she'd initially received evolved into subtle but insidious exclusion. The whispers behind her back grew louder, and the dismissive glances became harder to ignore. Morning rounds were a study in contrasts. Angela noticed the stark difference in how she was treated compared to her white colleagues. Dr. Greaves, in particular, seemed to take a certain pleasure in undermining her. One morning, as Angela reviewed patient charts at the nurses' station, his voice cut through the air like a whip. "Nurse Parker," he called out loudly, ensuring every ear nearby could hear. "I trust you've familiarized yourself with all our protocols by now? We can't afford any mistakes." Angela met his steely gaze, keeping her voice calm. "Of course, Dr. Greaves. I assure you, I'm well versed in all hospital procedures." His eyes narrowed, and a faint smirk curled his lips. "We'll see about that, won't we?" He muttered as he turned and walked away, his words dripping with condescension. Throughout her shifts, Angela was assigned the most difficult cases. While her colleagues handled routine tasks, she was sent to deal with complex procedures and the most challenging patients. It wasn't long before she realized this wasn't a coincidence. It was a deliberate test. "Angela," a nurse asked one afternoon, her tone deceptively sweet, "could you take Mr. Johnson in room 305? He's been a bit challenging today. Angela nodded, though she knew what challenging really meant. Mr. Johnson had gained a reputation for his racist outbursts, driving 2 nurses to tears that very week. Steeling herself, Angela entered his room with professionalism. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Johnson barked the moment he saw her. "I told them, I don't want no coloured nurse touching me." Angela took a deep breath, letting the sting of his words roll off her. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing. I assure you, I'm qualified to provide excellent care." As she worked, his insults rained down on her like blows, but Angela maintained her composure. She performed her duties with precision, refusing to let his bigotry affect the quality of her care. When she stepped out of his room, she found Dr. Greaves waiting nearby, a feigned look of concern on his face. "Everything all right in there, Nurse Parker?" he asked, loud enough for the surrounding staff to hear. "We heard quite a commotion." Angela met his gaze evenly, refusing to show any sign of weakness. "Mr. Johnson's vitals are stable, and his dressing has been changed. Is there anything else you need from me, Dr. Greaves?" For a moment, surprise flickered across his face before he masked it with his usual air of superiority. "Let's hope you can maintain that composure with all your patients," he said, his tone edged with a challenge. "We wouldn't want any complaints now, would we?" As he walked away, Angela felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her. She had just passed another unwarranted test, one she should never have been subjected to. The rest of her shift passed in a haze of endless tasks and microaggressions. Her workload was nearly double that of her colleagues, and she knew any slip-up would be magnified and used against her. By the time the day ended, Angela was utterly drained. As she gathered her belongings, she overheard 2 nurses whispering nearby. "Can you believe they're making such a big deal about these diversity hires?" one said, her voice dripping with disdain. "It's not like they can keep up with the rest of us anyway," the other replied. Angela froze, her heart pounding. She wanted to confront them, to defend herself and her abilities, but she knew it would only feed their biases. Instead, she quietly closed her locker and left the hospital, her head held high despite the heavy weight on her shoulders. At the bus stop, the sleek black Mercedes appeared once more, slowing to a crawl beside her. The window rolled down, and Dr. Greaves' voice called out, laced with mock sympathy. "Waiting for the bus again, Nurse Parker? Such a shame. That's all you can afford on a nurse's salary, isn't it?" Before Angela could respond, he sped away, leaving her standing there, humiliated yet fiercely determined. She boarded the bus, her mind racing with the events of the day. The hope and excitement she'd once felt seemed like a distant memory. But even as doubt threatened to creep in, Angela reminded herself of her mother's words and the strength she carried within her. Something had to change, and deep down, she knew it wouldn't be her that broke under the pressure. The following morning, Angela arrived at St. Mary's with her head held high, determined to face another day of challenges. As she moved through the halls, she noticed an unusual buzz in the air. Nurses and doctors seemed more animated than usual, their conversations tinged with curiosity and excitement. Angela approached one of her colleagues to ask what was happening. "We've got a VIP patient coming in," the nurse said, her tone unusually friendly. "Some big shot who had a skiing accident. Broke both arms, from what I heard." Before Angela could inquire further, Dr. Greaves appeared with his usual air of authority. "Nurse Parker," he said, his tone clipped and formal, "you'll be handling the new admission in room 412, Mr. Thomas Edwards. He's a high-profile patient, so I expect you to provide him with the utmost care and attention." Angela nodded, masking her suspicion. Being assigned such a significant patient was rare for someone in her position, especially given the way Dr. Greaves treated her. Still, she accepted the challenge. "Of course, Dr. Greaves," she replied calmly. "I'll see to it right away." As she approached room 412, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that this assignment was different. There was a peculiar air of importance surrounding the patient, and she couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. Inside, she found a middle-aged man lying in bed, both arms encased in casts. Despite his injuries, he exuded a quiet authority that immediately caught Angela's attention. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," Angela greeted warmly as she approached his bedside. "I'm Nurse Angela Parker, and I'll be taking care of you during your stay with us." Mr. Edwards looked up, his sharp eyes meeting hers. "Good morning, Nurse Parker," he replied, his voice strong and steady. "Thank you for your help. I didn't expect to end up here after my little adventure on the slopes." Angela smiled as she began checking his vitals and assessing his condition. She noticed how closely Mr. Edwards watched her, his gaze thoughtful and curious. Unlike many other patients she'd encountered, there was no hint of prejudice or condescension in his demeanor. "You seem very competent, Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards remarked as she adjusted his fore. "How long have you been working here at St. Mary's?" "Just a few weeks, sir," Angela replied, careful with her words. "It's been quite an experience so far." Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow, his tone tinged with amusement. "I can imagine," he said. "And has the hospital lived up to its prestigious reputation?" Angela hesitated, unsure of how to respond without revealing too much. Before she could answer, Dr. Greaves burst into the room, his demeanor suddenly bright and cheerful, a stark contrast to how he typically behaved. "Mr. Edwards!" Dr. Greaves exclaimed, his voice filled with an exaggerated warmth. "I trust Nurse Parker has been taking excellent care of you. We only assign our best staff to our most distinguished patients." Angela maintained her professional demeanor, even as irritation simmered beneath the surface. She knew full well that Dr. Greaves had never shown such confidence in her abilities before. "Indeed, Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards replied, his sharp gaze flicking between the doctor and Angela. "Nurse Parker has been exemplary." For a moment, Dr. Greaves' polished smile faltered before he quickly recovered. "That's wonderful to hear," he said. "We pride ourselves on maintaining a supportive and inclusive environment here at St. Mary's." Angela suppressed the urge to roll her eyes at his blatant hypocrisy. Mr. Edwards, however, seemed to pick up on the underlying tension. "Is that so?" Mr. Edwards mused, his tone thoughtful. "I'll be interested to see more of this supportive environment during my stay." As Dr. Greaves launched into an overly detailed explanation of Mr. Edwards' treatment plan, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that she was witnessing something significant. Mr. Edwards wasn't just observing the hospital. He was assessing it, and she suspected his quiet authority went far deeper than she initially realized. Over the next few days, Angela found herself spending more time in Mr. Edwards' room than with any other patient. Despite his injuries, he remained engaged and curious, often asking her questions about her work and background. Unlike others, his interest felt genuine, and for the first time since starting at St. Mary's, Angela felt truly seen. One afternoon, as Angela was changing Mr. Edwards' bandages, she overheard a heated conversation outside the room. "I don't care what Dr. Greaves says," a nurse whispered harshly. "I don't trust that Parker woman with our VIP patient. Who knows what she might do?" "I know," another voice replied. "But we can't say anything. They'll just accuse us of being racist." Angela's hands trembled slightly as she finished her task. The weight of the constant suspicion and mistrust bore down on her. "Is everything all right, Nurse Parker?" Mr. Edwards asked, his voice gentle but probing. Angela forced a smile. "Of course, Mr. Edwards. Just focusing on getting these bandages perfect." Mr. Edwards was silent for a moment, studying her face. "You know," he said finally, his tone thoughtful, "a person's true character is revealed not in how they treat their superiors, but in how they treat those they consider beneath them." Angela looked up, startled by the pointed nature of his comment. Mr. Edwards held her gaze, a knowing look in his eyes. "I've seen a lot in my time, Nurse Parker," he continued, "and I can tell you, the view from this bed has been enlightening." Angela left the room feeling both unnerved and strangely hopeful. There was more to Mr. Edwards than met the eye, and she couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was about to change everything. Dr. Greaves led Angela into a nearby private room, his face red with fury. As soon as the door shut behind them, he rounded on her, his voice dripping with venom. "How dare you question my judgment in front of everyone?" he hissed, his tone low but full of rage. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? You're lucky I don't fire you on the spot for such insubordination." Angela stood her ground, her voice calm yet firm. "Dr. Greaves, my concern was for the patient's safety. I was simply doing my job." He cut her off sharply, his voice rising. "Your job? Your job is to follow orders, not to act like you know better than your superiors. This is exactly why people like you don't belong in a prestigious institution like St. Mary's. You're here because of some misguided attempt at diversity, not because you have any real skill or knowledge." His words hit like a blow, their blatant prejudice leaving Angela momentarily speechless. She could feel a mix of anger and despair rising within her, but before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Dear Greaves," the voice said, calm but commanding, "I believe you've forgotten where you are and who you're speaking to." Angela and Dr. Greaves turned in unison to see Mr. Edwards sitting up in his bed, his expression one of controlled anger. His usually composed demeanor had shifted, and an unmistakable authority radiated from him. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves stammered, his face paling as the weight of the situation dawned on him. I didn't realize you were awake. I apologize if we disturbed you." Mr. Edwards' gaze didn't waver. "Oh, I've been awake, Dr. Greaves," he replied, his tone icy. "Awake long enough to witness the disgraceful way you've been treating Nurse Parker, and others, I imagine. This behavior ends now." Angela stood frozen, barely believing what she was hearing. Mr. Edwards, the quiet, seemingly ordinary patient, was suddenly the most powerful figure in the room. Dr. Greaves tried to recover, his voice trembling. "There's been a misunderstanding, Mr. Edwards. I assure you—" "There's no misunderstanding," Mr. Edwards interrupted sharply. "What I've witnessed here is a clear pattern of discrimination and unprofessionalism, and as someone with the authority to do so, I intend to address it." It was then that the full realization hit Angela. Mr. Edwards wasn't just a VIP patient. His demeanor, his words, and now his authority made it clear that he was far more influential than anyone had suspected. Who are you?" Dr. Greaves asked, his earlier bravado completely gone. Mr. Edwards allowed a small, cold smile. "Someone who has the power to determine this hospital's future. And right now, Dr. Greaves, I'm not feeling particularly inclined to support an institution that tolerates such blatant racism and unprofessional behavior." Dr. Greaves stood there, ashen-faced, as Angela felt a mix of relief, vindication, and hope wash over her. For the first time since she started at St. Mary's, it felt like someone truly understood and was willing to stand up for her. What Angela didn't know was that this confrontation was just the beginning. The ripple effect of Mr. Edwards' actions would soon challenge the very foundation of St. Mary's General Hospital, bringing long-buried prejudices into the light and forcing a reckoning that was long overdue. The room felt heavy with tension as Mr. Edwards' words lingered in the air. Dr. Greaves, pale and visibly shaken, struggled to find a response. Angela, still processing the unexpected turn of events, remained silent, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves stammered, his voice faltering, "I assure you, the situation is not as it seems. Any perceived issues are purely misunderstandings." Mr. Edwards fixed him with a piercing gaze. "Misunderstandings?" he repeated, his voice calm but edged with authority. "What I've seen goes far beyond that. It's systemic, and it's unacceptable." At that moment the door opened, and a nurse stepped inside, her expression nervous. "Dr. Greaves," she said hesitantly, "the hospital administrator needs to see you immediately." Dr. Greaves hesitated, looking between Mr. Edwards and the nurse, clearly torn. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "We'll continue this discussion later," he said, his tone sharp. "Mr. Edwards." "Nurse Parker." As Dr. Greaves exited the room, Angela found herself alone with Mr. Edwards. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards said finally, his voice softer now, "I think it's time I properly introduced myself. My name is Thomas Edwards, and I'm the CEO of Healthcare United, one of the largest healthcare conglomerates in the country." Angela's eyes widened in shock. She had heard of Healthcare United. It was a powerhouse in the medical field, with a reputation for wielding immense influence. Suddenly, everything about Mr. Edwards' demeanor and actions made perfect sense. "I had no idea," Angela said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Edwards gestured to a chair. "Please sit," he said. "I think we have much to discuss." Over the next hour, Mr. Edwards revealed how his unplanned stay at St. Mary's had opened his eyes to the deep-seated issues within the hospital. "I came here expecting excellent medical care," he said, his tone tinged with disappointment. "But what I witnessed instead was a culture of discrimination and unprofessionalism that has no place in modern healthcare." He listened intently as Angela recounted her experiences, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. As she shared the challenges she had faced, the whispered comments, the exclusion, the blatant attempts to undermine her, Mr. Edwards' expression grew increasingly serious. "Your story is deeply troubling," he said when she finished, his voice firm. "And unfortunately, it's not unique. But it's also unacceptable, and it must end." As they spoke, the door opened again, and the hospital administrator entered, her expression flustered. "Mr. Edwards," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I understand there are concerns about our practices. I want to assure you that we take these matters very seriously." Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" he asked pointedly. "Because from what I've observed, this hospital has been more concerned with maintaining appearances than addressing its underlying issues." The administrator paled, clearly unprepared for such direct criticism. We have diversity initiatives in place," she offered weakly. "Initiatives are not enough," Mr. Edwards cut her off sharply. "What you need is a complete overhaul of your culture, starting at the top." He laid out his demands: a full investigation into discriminatory practices, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, and a revamp of the hospital's hiring and promotion policies. He also made it clear that Dr. Greaves' behavior would be thoroughly investigated. His actions were not only unprofessional but also discriminatory and potentially harmful to patient care, Mr. Edwards said, his tone resolute. The administrator nodded, clearly grasping the gravity of the situation. "Of course, Mr. Edwards. We'll begin implementing these changes immediately." As the meeting concluded, word of Mr. Edwards' true identity and his demands for change began to spread through the hospital. The atmosphere shifted. Fear and anticipation rippled through the staff, while some began to feel a glimmer of hope. Angela, still processing everything, felt a sense of relief and validation she hadn't experienced before. For the first time, it seemed like real change was possible, and she wasn't alone in this fight. As the news of Mr. Edwards' identity spread throughout St. Mary's General Hospital, the once calm corridors buzzed with whispers and speculation. Staff huddled in small groups, casting curious glances at Angela, whose role in the unfolding events had become the center of attention. Early the next morning, Angela arrived at the hospital to find an unusually tense atmosphere. News vans lined the streets outside, reporters jostling for statements from anyone willing to speak. Inside, the tension was palpable. At the nurses' station, Angela noticed Dr. Greaves being escorted by security toward the administration offices. Their eyes met briefly, his filled with a mix of anger and fear, before he quickly looked away. "Angela!" a hesitant voice called out. Turning, Angela saw Sarah, one of her colleagues who had previously been cold toward her. She approached with a tentative smile. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," Sarah said awkwardly, "for how I treated you. I didn't realize." Angela nodded, accepting the apology but unsure how to respond. Before she could reply, an announcement came over the PA system. All staff are required to attend an emergency meeting in the main auditorium in 30 minutes. Attendance is mandatory. The auditorium was packed when Angela arrived. She found a seat near the back, acutely aware of the stares and murmurs directed her way. At the front, Mr. Edwards stood alongside the hospital administrator and a few other officials, his presence commanding immediate attention. Once the room settled, Mr. Edwards stepped up to the podium, his voice calm yet firm. "Good morning," he began. "For those who don't know, I'm Thomas Edwards, CEO of Healthcare United. Over the past week, I've been a patient here at St. Mary's, recovering from an accident. During my stay, I've observed this hospital's day-to-day operations and its culture." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. What I witnessed was deeply troubling, a culture of bias, discrimination, and unprofessionalism that has no place in healthcare. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Angela felt the weight of countless eyes turning toward her. "The treatment of Nurse Angela Parker," Mr. Edwards continued, his tone growing sharper, "is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a systemic problem that has been allowed to fester for far too long." He outlined a series of changes to be implemented immediately, including a thorough investigation into discriminatory practices, mandatory diversity training for all staff, and a complete overhaul of hiring and promotion policies. Additionally, he said, his voice hardening, those found to have engaged in discriminatory behavior will face serious consequences. This includes Dr. William Greaves, who has been suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct. A fresh wave of whispers swept the room as Dr. Greaves' supporters exchanged shocked and angry glances, while others seemed quietly relieved. "Change is never easy," Mr. Edwards said, his tone softening slightly. "But it's necessary, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it leads to better outcomes for everyone. A diverse, inclusive, and respectful workplace benefits both staff and patients alike." As his speech concluded, Mr. Edwards made one final announcement. "Lastly, I want to introduce someone who will play a pivotal role in leading these changes," he said, gesturing toward Angela. "Nurse Angela Parker has agreed to take on the position of Chief Diversity Officer at St. Mary's. Her experiences and insights will be invaluable as we work to transform this institution." Angela's breath caught as applause filled the room. She hadn't expected this announcement. She had only discussed joining the Diversity Committee with Mr. Edwards. Summoning her courage, she made her way to the front of the room. Standing at the podium, she took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she began, her voice steady. "To everyone here, I want to say this. I stand before you not as an adversary, but as a colleague who believes in the potential of St. Mary's and everyone in this room. The road ahead will be challenging, but together We can create a hospital where every staff member feels valued, and every patient receives the best care, regardless of their background." As Angela spoke, she noticed some staff nodding in agreement, while others sat quietly, their expressions contemplative. Even those who had been openly dismissive of her seemed to be listening intently. After the meeting, Angela found herself surrounded by colleagues, some offering congratulations, others apologizing for past behavior, and a few extending cautious olive branches. The atmosphere in the hospital had shifted. While tension and uncertainty remained, there was also a palpable sense of hope and possibility. For the first time since starting at St. Mary's, Angela felt like real change was within reach. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of Mr. Edwards' intervention were impossible to ignore. The entire hospital seemed to be caught in the wake of a transformation that had long been overdue. Staff whispered in corners, some openly supportive of the changes, while others remained resistant, their discomfort with the shifting dynamics evident in their uneasy glances and hushed tones. Angela, now stepping into her role as Chief Diversity Officer, felt the weight of her new responsibilities. She worked closely with Mr. Edwards and the hospital administration to lay the groundwork for the promised reforms. Mandatory diversity and inclusion training sessions were scheduled, policies were reviewed, and a comprehensive investigation into discriminatory practices was underway. Dr. Greaves, suspended and awaiting the results of the investigation, was notably absent. His departure sent a clear signal to the rest of the staff that such behavior would no longer be tolerated. One afternoon, as Angela walked through the halls, she noticed a shift in how her colleagues interacted with her. Staff who had once ignored or dismissed her now greeted her with tentative smiles or respectful nods. Some even stopped to ask for her input, acknowledging her new role. "Angela," Sarah called out as she caught up to her near the nurses' station. Her once cold demeanor had softened considerably. "I wanted to thank you for everything you're doing. I didn't realize how blind I'd been to what was happening around here." Angela nodded, offering a small smile. "It's not easy to see something when it doesn't affect you directly," she said gently. "But change starts with awareness. I appreciate your support." As word of the changes at St. Mary's spread beyond the hospital walls, news outlets began to cover the story. Angela found herself in the spotlight, invited to speak at conferences and seminars about her experiences and the ongoing transformation at St. Mary's. 1 year after Mr. Edwards' intervention, Angela stood before a packed auditorium at a national healthcare conference. "A year ago," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion, "I was a nurse on the brink of giving up. Today, I stand here as proof that change is possible, that one voice, no matter how small it may seem, can spark a movement." She shared the story of St. Mary's transformation, highlighting both the challenges and the triumphs. She spoke about the importance of resilience, the power of allyship, and the need for systemic change in healthcare. After her speech, Angela was approached by Mr. Edwards, now fully recovered from his injuries. "Angela," he greeted her warmly, "you've come a long way from the nurse I met a year ago." They discussed the progress at St. Mary's and the impact it had on other hospitals in the Healthcare United network. Mr. Edwards shared how several facilities had begun implementing similar programs, inspired by Angela's story. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when I first arrived at St. Mary's, I never imagined the journey it would set in motion. But you've not only transformed that hospital, you've reignited my own passion for this work." Angela felt a surge of gratitude as they parted ways. She returned to St. Mary's with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to tackle the challenges that still lay ahead. Walking through the hospital's main lobby, she paused in front of a newly installed mural depicting a diverse group of healthcare professionals working together. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling." Angela smiled, her heart swelling with pride. The road to change was far from over, but for the first time, she felt confident that they were heading in the right direction. Together, they were building a future where every staff member could thrive, and every patient could receive the care they deserved, free of prejudice or bias. In the months that followed, St. Mary's General Hospital underwent a remarkable transformation. Under Angela's leadership as Chief Diversity Officer, and with Mr. Edwards' unwavering support, the once toxic environment began to shift. The hospital introduced mandatory diversity and inclusion training, which was initially met with resistance, but gradually opened minds and softened hearts. The investigation into discriminatory practices uncovered troubling truths, leading to structural changes within the hospital. Dr. Greaves, following the inquiry into his conduct, was formally dismissed, a decision that sent a clear message: discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. Angela became a key figure in the hospital's cultural overhaul, working tirelessly to ensure that the promised changes were not just words but actions. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Healthcare leaders across the country began reaching out, inviting Angela to share her insights at seminars and conferences. 1 year to the day after Mr. Edwards' intervention, Angela found herself on stage at a prestigious national healthcare conference. Looking out at the packed auditorium, she felt a mix of nerves and pride. "A year ago," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I was a nurse struggling to find her place in a hostile environment. Today, I stand before you as living proof that change is possible, that one voice, one story, can inspire a movement." Angela recounted the challenges she faced at St. Mary's, the biases she endured, and the journey toward transforming the hospital into a place of inclusion and respect. She spoke of the staff who had joined her in this mission, the lives touched by their efforts, and the hope they had ignited for a better future. When her speech concluded, the audience erupted in applause. Among the crowd was Mr. Edwards, now fully recovered, his pride in Angela evident as he approached her after the event. "Angela," he said, a warm smile on his face, "you've exceeded every expectation. What you've accomplished at St. Mary's has had a ripple effect far beyond its walls." Angela smiled, humbled by his words. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards. I couldn't have done it without your support. You've done more than transform St. Mary's," he continued. "You've shown us what's possible when we commit to true inclusion. Other hospitals in the Healthcare United network are following your lead. Your story is becoming a blueprint for change." Back at St. Mary's, Angela returned to a hospital that looked and felt different. Staff who had once been skeptical of the changes now worked together with a newfound sense of collaboration and mutual respect. In the main lobby, Angela paused in front of a new mural, a vibrant depiction of healthcare professionals from diverse backgrounds working as a team. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Diversity unites us. Inclusion drives us. Compassion defines us." Angela's heart swelled with pride as she reflected on how far they had come. While the work was far from finished, the foundation for a brighter, more inclusive future had been laid. The journey that began with a single voice, her voice, had grown into a movement, proving that even the smallest ripple could create waves of lasting change. And for Angela, this was just the beginning.